Welcome to the Sound of Resistance channel. While the Kherson region, one of the most important regions of Ukraine, echoes with the footsteps of Ukrainian warriors approaching step by step, Russian leader Putin remains silent. After the vehicle convoys of Ukrainians approaching Kherson appeared, the eyes were turned to Putin. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian army is experiencing one of the biggest retreats in Ukraine. After the Russian government's decision to withdraw from Kherson in the past days, many Russian soldiers were evacuated from the region. With the evacuation of the residents in Kherson, which has been going on since the beginning of this month, and the withdrawal of the Russian soldiers, the streets of Kherson fell into a deep silence. But Ukrainian officials interpret this silence as the calm before the storm. The Ukrainian army is taking all its steps cautiously, suspecting that there may be a trap behind the withdrawal of the Russian army. A huge convoy of vehicles belonging to Ukrainian soldiers was seen approaching Kherson the other day. Ukrainians are entering Kherson, and it was a question of what it awaits Ukrainian soldiers in Kherson. It seems that Ukrainian President Zelensky is determined to take all of Kherson and inflict the biggest loss on Putin in the war. Ukraine is slowly advancing in the southern Kherson region as it continues to push back Russian forces. A video has emerged showing a long Ukrainian military convoy near the city of Kherson, which remains the only city Russia continues to occupy. This comes amid conflict reports about whether Russia will withdraw from the city of Kherson at all costs or keep the city, the largest urban area under Russian control. For Russian President Vladimir Putin, losing Kherson will mark one of the most important blows he has taken in the war in Ukraine. Beyond the symbolic victory for Ukraine, Kherson is also an important industrial city with a major port on the Black Sea. Kherson also serves as an important link in shipping grain and petroleum products to the rest of the world. The video of the crowd of troops and military vehicles belonging to the Ukrainian army stunned those who saw it on social media. Before the expected clash in Kherson, a 24-hour curfew was declared in the city while Russian flags were lowered from official buildings. Oleg, the commander of a Ukrainian infantry unit west of Kherson, said the Russians remaining to fight in Kherson would have to leave the strategic city due to worsening weather conditions, logistical bottlenecks, and the threat of a siege. Oleg, the commander of a Ukrainian infantry unit, stated that he expects a bloody war in Kherson. After the Ukrainian forces slowly entered the Kherson region, they were overjoyed at what they saw. The Russian army repeated the mistake it always made when retreating from Kherson, leaving weapons and military equipments in the area. The Ukrainian armed forces made a welcome discovery as they seized chests of Russian ammunition in the newly liberated Kherson. Russia's abandoned military positions in Kherson provided rich choices of advancing Ukrainian troops. With the large quantities of ammunition reportedly abandoned in the Kremlin's hasty retreat from the city to the south. After the withdrawal of the Russian army, the Ukrainian armed forces began to ensure the security of the city. News reporters in Kherson on the ammunition of the Russian army, they left a huge amount of ammunition. Box was thrown on the top of the box. Russian soldiers left here about 24 hours ago and disappeared in an instant. But you can see all the bombs that Russian soldiers left in Kherson. They are now captured by Ukrainian soldiers, he said. On Friday, Ukrainian troops began to enter the liberated city of Kherson in southern Ukraine after a large-scale withdrawal of Russian troops began. The withdrawal from Kherson is the latest in a series of serious military setbacks from Moscow following the recapture of large areas of the Kharkov region by the Ukrainian armed forces. In Kherson, Ukrainian soldiers were greeted by crowds waving the national flags and chanting "Glory to Ukraine." Serhiy Klan, a Ukrainian regional official, disputed the Russian defense minister, claimed that 30,000 retreating soldiers took all 5,000 pieces of equipment with them, saying lots of equipment was left behind. Russia's final withdrawal comes 6 weeks after Russian President Vladimir Putin's illegal annexation of the Kherson region and 3 other Ukrainian provinces, promising to remain Russian forever. After the withdrawal order was given during the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Moscow forces still control about 70% of the Kherson area. Kremlin shocked everyone with its statements the other day. The Kremlin continued to challenge Ukraine in Kherson, insisting that the withdrawal was in no way an embarrassment to Putin. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Moscow continues to consider the entire Kherson region as part of Russia. He added that the Kremlin does not regret holding celebrations for the annexation of the occupied or partially occupied parts of Ukraine a little more than a month ago, and that the Russian Ministry of Defense is the addressee of all questions regarding the withdrawal of the Russian army from Kherson. Putin has so far remained silent about Kherson despite his numerous public appearances since the withdrawal was announced. Shortly before Russia announced that Russian troops are withdrawing from Kherson, the office of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the situation in the province as difficult. He reported that the Russia has bombed several villages and towns that Ukrainian forces has recaptured in recent weeks during their counterattack in the Kherson region. The Ukrainian Army's General Staff said Russian forces had left behind looted houses, damaged power lines, and mined roads as they retreated from Kherson. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mykola Podolyak predicted that the departing Russian would try to make Kherson a city of death and would continue bombing once it was moved across the Dnieper River. Ukrainian officials have been wary of the Russian withdrawal announced this week as they fear their troops may be ambushed in the pre-war city of Kherson, which had a population of 280,000. Russian soldiers were confused after the developments in Ukraine. Russian soldiers began to question why they were in Ukraine. A major uprising in the Russian army seems to be imminent. In the Russian army, after the negative events in Ukraine, uprisings have already begun to break out. Thousands of newly enlisted soldiers in the Russian army revolted last night in the country amid an increasing challenge to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. Angry soldiers, forcibly mobilized into Russian army, erupted last night in the city of Kazan, in southwestern Russia, as thousands of people rioted. The riots ignited in military training camps as hasty commanders desperately tried to prepare new requirements for the front line in Ukraine. Videos shared on social media show about 25,000 Russian soldiers rioting due to poor living conditions and a lack of modern weapons. The latest intelligence briefing from the UK Ministry of Defense shows that the 300,000 soldiers that Vladimir Putin enlisted as part of his mobilization campaign provide little additional offensive combat capability. The Minister of Defense claims that the Russian army is struggling to train soldiers and many commanders are being held at the front. Some news agencies made the headlines of Russian soldiers in Kazan. In the news it shared, the Russian men mobilized in Kazan revolted because of the poor living conditions and the rusty assault rifles of the 1970s. Russian soldiers lacked food, water and firewood and had nowhere to wash their clothes. In Ukraine, while the fire in Kherson does not go out, on the other hand, the uprising in the Russian army and the Kremlin continue to occupy the agenda. The Ukrainians seem content with the course of the war. Zelensky stated that many doors will open from them after their complete capture of Kherson. President of the Ukraine Zelensky stated that especially Crimea is very important for Ukraine and they will take back the city, which has been under Russian domination since. The Ukrainian army and people have shown an example of unity and solidarity against the Russian army until today. And they won all successes in the Ukrainian together. In the following days, we can see many cities decorated with Ukrainian flags. Thank you for watching us.